what I know for sure is that people don't get divorced instantly, that there's usually something that's been building up for a long time. You know how you have these chronic patterns in relationships, anyways, even the one with yourself, like you might be on your case during certain types of year, like when it's pre-summer, like, hey, you better start exercising more and not eating so much. Well, usually when we're in close relationships with people, our own internal critic becomes a critic for them as well. And if we don't talk about things openly and find ways to talk about things, then things build up. And this is where I see a pattern of resentment happening in relationships. You probably hang out with couples. I know I do. And there's some couples that I feel like, oh, they have really great this and that, you know? And then other times I'm like, oh, this couple always has this heated way of fighting, but they don't really talk enough about what's going on. And so I can see it doesn't resolve. Um, and so when you're thinking about your own couple relationship, you might want to think about it with like sort of a two views of a camera. One, the camera would be facing a screen, and you could kind of see yourself in relationships, sort of playing out dynamics, the things that bother you about the person, and the parts of yourself that bothers the other person. You probably know what they are. They know what it is that bothers you. So when these things build up, there's these dynamics that get played out, and people feel them all around you. You feel them yourself. Some days you can handle things better, and some days you feel like this buildup is too much. I need a break. If you don't have a good support system, you probably don't really get the breaks that you need. If you don't do your own personal work, you're not going to be able to shift anything within yourself. So a lot of times, um, relationships that are long and enduring, or they go through lots of phases in life, life is complicated and complex. How we manage different parts of our life and our personality, and if we have kids, how we manage that. Role that we've taken on, that responsibility that we've taken on, and we put a lot on relationships. And so sometimes a relationship is just this very delicate thing that two people created, like a baby, right? Except for that, it's actually a developmental model of relationships, is that the relationship grows over time and is able to handle lots and lots of things. But sometimes the relationship gets too much stress and it can't take much anymore. And it doesn't have the skill set to endure some things. Like we saw a lot of separations in COVID time, but we also saw a lot of relationships coming together because there was a challenge and a struggle, and people came together and were able to endure it. Well, also, those same things can actually break a relationship up because the relationship might be worn down and it doesn't have the capacity to endure anything when it's worn down. So typically, when people are thinking about separating, there's been a challenge in the relationship for a while, and it might not have gotten better. It might have been a chronic cycle, and sometimes it was good and sometimes it wasn't. And and there's ways that the relationship or the two people pattern around the cycle that goes on in the marriage. A lot of times people stay in long-term marriages and they bring elements into their lives to kind of endure the marriage. And sometimes that helps people stay in the marriage. Like, for example, affairs. It's common that that is a need that isn't being met in the relationship, whatever that person is providing that other person. It could just be another outlet. It could be emotional, it could be intimate, sexual, it could be intellectual, physical, like in terms of like a physical athlete getting together with another physical athlete because they really want a companion in doing that. And so it allows the other relationship to exist for longer. uh, Sometimes there's, drugs, alcohol, mental health issues, friendships that come in the way of relationships. Sometimes those elements, not if it's an addictive nature or, some mental health issue that isn't addressed, sometimes those things can be really healthy, like, friendships or time away or travel or hobbies that you have, because it just brings you into a closer connection with yourself where you feel really good about yourself. So you can share yourself with your partner in different and better ways. Um, so there's the healthy things that happen in the relationship and the chronic patterns. So typically there's a buildup, and there's usually one person that's making a decision to leave, the initiator, and the recipient is usually given the information. Sometimes the recipient changes into the initiator because the initiator is just kind of stuck and not changing or moving forward. And they decide that they can't do it, right? They can initiate, but they can't follow through because usually the initiator is ruled by guilt and responsibility, and the recipient is ruled by feelings of hope and rejection. In any case, usually someone initiates some kind of motion, and even a behavioral change or behavioral um, intolerance can be presented as the reason for the separation. So, like, let's say the person stopped talking or connecting with the other person. They were always angry at the other person. That behavior would be the initiator. Um, so during that part, I always find that the process is really outlined by one key concept, and that people aim to do the hardest thing first, whatever that might be. And I often find the hardest thing for folks is the physical separation, to actually move away from that person. That's the hardest thing because it's a sort of a, sometimes it's an outward conversation, sometimes it's an internal conversation where one party's like, that person's never going to leave, so I have to leave, right? Because I'm never going to be able to be here. Otherwise, it's going to be like War of the Roses. That there was a film made, War of the Roses meant that people stayed and stayed in the same place, and they just like destroyed the place, right? So no one could have it. But sometimes there is that sort of incapable personality, or the person who isn't resourceful and isn't able to um, put together a plan to leave. So it's always like the other person that needs to do it if they want to get away. So people find all different creative ways to do that. And they also find protective ways to do that, because sometimes that looks like abandonment. So you really want to make sure that however you do that, that you're always making yourself safe in terms of financially, legally, and just physically, that you're safe. Um, so people do the hardest thing first, and sometimes I help them do that hardest thing as a, a mediator and a seasoned co-parenting therapist. I help them do that hardest thing, and I don't hear from them for a real long time until there's another indicator, like they need to make some financial decisions, or the house might need to be sold, or somebody wants to move, or somebody is getting into a new relationship. Most of the relationships that I work with are people who are parents, because people who are parents have to figure out how they can stay somehow connected or not, raising their kids. So if they're not connected, what we call that is parallel parenting, where they don't really get involved with talking to the other person about parenting. Most parents aim for being involved, and therefore everything like sharing finances and housing and decisions about the kids. So they stay much more involved, or try to, most people. So the process is the hardest thing would go first, and then the other things would be teased out. Some people go incredibly fast when they get divorced. They're just angry and they want it to be done, but they're highly emotional and reactive. So it's a very difficult to have communications with folks, and that's why I always tell people, like, even if you are pretty healthy in your communication and not so reactive, like you both really understand why this is happening, to have a professional to just sit and have a container for you to talk about these things is really important, because you're not listening as much as maybe preparing what you're going to be saying. Um, but there's a lot of conversations that need to be had. And the role of finding professionals to help you through this is critical. So then there's the idea of filing. People will choose when they're working with a professional who, even if they're not, who's going to file, who's going to be the petitioner, and who's going to be the recipient. And it's really important to make sure that's a humane process, because this whole process, especially if there's a lot of anger, can be done sort of with irreparable damage. Like people cannot forgive the other person for like spending a ton of the money, or um, just taking the most valuable thing that was their parents, or you know, all the things that become very important and symbolic in a relationship. So you really want to make sure that all of it is as respectful as possible. And that's why professionals can help people through this very emotional time, and to sort of direct it in a forward motion where there can be civil conversations and decisions that are made. I would really recommend that. So when somebody files, the clock starts, and there's a 6 month period of time, 6 months to a day. And all these decisions are supposed to be made in that period of time. And that gives the people a little bit of time not to be instantly divorced, but to really think about it. And then the judge looks at all of the filings and makes a decision on whether he feels like that is fair. So a lot of times, the reason why there is a court of law is because it's a guiding principle of the law that matters, which means that anyone who is sort of socially, educationally, or economically at a difference from the other person, um, or is in the less sort of dominant role in those areas, needs to be protected. And so, um, looking at ways for that there might be disparity in some of the agreements can be analyzed by a judge, and to make it fair. So, um, there's all sorts of ways, if there's contempt, that people try to make it unfair, but there is a process of divorce to try to make it fair. And that's why it's really important behind the scenes, if you are wanting to do a lot of the divorce yourself, that you still get a consulting attorney to just advise you on areas that you might want to consider, to look at the paperwork that you're going to sign to make sure that it's complete and accurate. And even if you're seeing like a mediator together, like a mediator lawyer or a paralegal mediator, you want to make sure that you're really addressing the things that need to be addressed and questioning the things that need to be questioned, because this is an educational process and you're not going to become an expert on getting divorced. So you need to make sure that you understand the process that you're in. Um, so after that period of time, so there's paperwork filled out that has to do with financial disclosures and assets, and splitting of assets, and splitting of um, the way the household has been run. And sometimes there's alimony, oftentimes there's child support. And aside from all of the financial legals, there's also what's written up in the divorce settlement agreement is the parent settlement agreement, which contains certain aspects of how kids are going to be raised, and sort of philosophies that you have. There's also a calendar of events, so that a fiscal school year calendar is documented for 1 year of how you're going to make decisions. And then um, there's also the divorce settlement agreement, which just has all your financial agreements and how things are going to be separated. Typically, there's only a few scenarios that every family can do based on the financial picture. So it's always good to just have someone lay those things out for you. Um, Also, the filing is complicated, so you want to make sure that you file the forms in the right order, or else the whole thing will be rejected and you'll have to redo it. And by the time you finish the filing, the judge will take, depending on how long and how backed up the court is, anywhere. Like during COVID time, I saw it being out 90, let's see, probably a year and a half. It was probably out the divorce settlement agreement. So people, it took a while to be divorced, and sometimes you can actually hire a private judge, they can make the divorce go a little bit faster. And a lot of times that's not as expensive as you would think. It might be another $1,000. And if the court system is backed up, things that you might want to think about of why you would want to make your divorce faster is maybe there's financial considerations or implications in terms of a tax year. Um, Maybe you're going to move, maybe you're going to sell your house. Maybe these decisions really need to be made for various reasons of financial constraints. So, all of those are things to think about. Um, and then the process goes into more of an emotional process where you would be starting to talk to community and family about what's happening and your children. And all of that needs to be prepared, um, and managed and strategized so that it's done well, so that the divorce, and my mantra is the divorce can be a transition, not a trauma. And there'll be elements of it that are traumatic and sad, and there'll be grief for you and your family and your community. But if it is handled well and there is someone sort of marking the process for you, it can continue to move forward. And the best way you can show up can happen. So that is one of the things I want to outline. From there, once everything has been filed, then life starts getting back to normal. Kids have a schedule. They see the parent during certain times. Things are figured out. Finances are split. The kids and the homes are financed certain ways. And a lot of times people are existing on like half the money that was a part of the household before. So it's always important to try to keep that standard of living the same for each party. But a lot of changes usually happen during this period. There's changes of physical location, sometimes jobs. People have to work more, they have to work smarter. School systems are changed. Social life has changed, your social structure has changed. Maybe the people you hung out with is different. Maybe you're needing to make new friends. Maybe you start dating. So there's a lot of changes that happen in the months preceding um, figuring out the separation and divorce. And a lot of times people do things in different orders. Like people might do the aim towards the physical separation, start working on the legal financial, and um, and then continue on telling the kids the divorce is not even filed, but they may be moving forward with different elements. So things are staggered, right? Because you're also working within a human system where people have schedules and might not be able to see you all the time. And so you need to really work on sort of managing your expectations about your timeline. It's also really important if you work with people that you're comfortable with the people that you work with. Like, for example, um, the hand holding that you might need if you have a retained lawyer, if you're working with a retained lawyer, or you have a consulting lawyer, that you might want to just think about how they're talking to you. Does their philosophy make sense? A lot of times I've seen when people have two lawyers and there's more of a litigation, sometimes that's important because maybe there's a higher level of assets and more discrepancies, and that needs to be understood, maybe with a forensic accountant to understand all the finances and all the financial decisions. But it's also really important that you find a person that's going to support you, that speaks your language, that doesn't talk down to you, that actually can be a supportive person. And remember, whoever you're hiring to be the legal um, advisor to you is not your therapist. So make sure that you're very clear about not using them for emotional support, but getting your emotional support before and after those meetings and planning what sort of rational things that you need to discuss with the lawyer. If it's a mediator, it's the same, that you would make sure that you really like how they're working, how they're writing up things so that it works and it's in sync with how you think and how you feel, like respected in those meetings. That's all very, very important because that's a part of your personal experience. And your personal experience should be one that you feel safe in if you're trying to explore something that's difficult to do. Um, and then from there, I always say there's like different dimensions, like you'll go through all your legal and financial agreements. Let's say you get to the end where actually the judge approves the divorce, and then you come back with your divorce date, and you still have lots of adjustments to make in your life from that point because maybe things are certain areas are starting to settle down, but some other areas are still needing to be worked on, like your kids adjusting. And maybe they adjust really well at first, and maybe once they realize it's permanent, they start acting out. And so you need to consider how you're going to help them with the schedule, with transitioning, with managing their stress in the situation that they're in. And I always say, children do much better if their parents do. And one of the reasons why I got in this line of work is because I was working with a lot of children from divorced families, and I felt like the only way I could really help them was to help the people that were raising them. And so that's what I try to do is now is support the parents who are getting divorced so the kids can have a more stabilized life. It will be a little unstable for a little bit because there's a lot of emotions and a lot of things being figured out. But I always remind parents, tell that to your kids. Like, we're working out these things, we're figuring out this. We're in a transition and we're figuring out our transition. We're all going through this at the same time and we're going to try to do it better and better. Um, so this is a new thing that needs to be worked on. Holidays, the first year of going through the calendar is really significant that you do that calendar because this is a significant change in the family structure. And so maybe sharing a holiday is something that you all do the first year, but maybe the second year it felt a little too much stressful and a little too sad. And so people change how they deal with that. Sometimes people are very connected and they stay connected as parents closely so they can do overlap easily. And sometimes it's so um, pure and precious the time that you have with your kids because you'll be having less time. And most people aim for 50-50, but sometimes when kids are younger, one parent who's the primary caretaker gets a little bit more time. Sometimes other parents get more vacation time. One parent gets more of the daily, regular routine time. So all of those are things to be considered. But to know that there'll always be another stage that you have to help your kids to adjust, and there'll be another stage where you're like, oh, we mastered that. Like everyone gets the stuff back and forth. Everybody remembers the calendar. Um, Everyone does their transition pretty well, and everyone's settled into both homes. The one gift, maybe, or the silver lining, is that the relationship between you and your kid can strengthen because um, they don't have to contend with, and nor do you, the the couple relationship within the parenting relationship. So sometimes it's a lot easier just to have one relationship that you're managing, like the parenting relationship. So that's the process that I see people go through. I also wanted to mention that there's a discernment process that you can also get help with someone who's called a discernment counselor who can talk about the pros and cons of your relationship staying together or ending. And a lot of times people choose to work on the relationship a little bit longer to see if they can get into addressing some of the red flags in the relationship and that they can counter that and stay together. And so it's always good to have some kind of emotional process um, prior to getting divorced so that you understand it and you have your own individual process that you understand your changes and the effects of the ending of this relationship.